Hello. So this one's actually quite a good one. This is going to be a follow-on from the last video, which was kind of interacting between Python and SQL Server using the extended stored proc. This one's kind of an extension of that. This one actually gives the ability to actually use Python and machine learning kind of inside an ETL. Therefore actually have it as part of your ETL flow, dipping in and out of Python in order to actually use machine learning to classify your data, to sort your data, to actually be part of your algorithms within your ETL. And we're actually going to do it by storing the actual machine learning models. We're actually going to store them in SQL Server. So SQL Server is actually going to store the model itself, which obviously can then be passed out to Python. Python uses it and then stored in SQL Server. So it's actually quite a fun thing to do, and well, we'll just see what happens. So we're going to start off just basically pretending we've been given some stupid data. Now, just to clarify from the start, this is ridiculous data. This is not going to be a whole kind of how we do machine learning. This is like the most basic thing. I'm not going to go into it. I'm just going to use very set methods. But yeah, you'll see. So this is the data we've got, and it's basically just fruit. So what we're doing is I'm just going to run this in, and effectively we're imagining that someone is sending us this. This is all we're receiving. These just 15 records here. This is all we're kind of getting from people. It's just width and height of fruit. Really handy. So this is what's coming into our kind of extract part, our import part of the ETL. We obviously need this classifying before we can do anything with it. So as part of our ETL, we want to classify this data. Now, this is not the easiest thing to do inside SQL Server, to actually have kind of rules around what it can do, what it should look for, how it should look for it, that kind of thing. We can eyeball it, not very helpful in ETL. Now, SQL Server could probably be programmed to do this, but again, pain in the bum. Much easier to actually have a model and use something like Python to actually do this for us. So we're going to imagine that what we've done in this scenario is we've taken this data and we have painstakingly established what it is. So kind of the things that are roughly round are going to be classed as oranges. The things that are slightly more oval, they're going to be the apples. And then the things that are just long and thin, they're going to be bananas. So like I said, this isn't going to be in-depth Python machine learning. This is pretty easy to classify, but you kind of get what we're getting at. We've got the different classifications. We've based it on kind of our eyeballing, so we kind of know what data we've got. So what we can now do is we can take this to Python and actually get Python to produce a model so that it can replicate this kind of prediction based on just receiving this data. So I'm going to flick into Python. So I'm going to go over here and create a new file, fruits, because we're dealing with fruit. Now for this one, normally I would sit here and type it all. There's a lot of typing in this one, so I'm just going to do a bit of a copy and paste job and explain it as I go. So for this, to start with, we've got PYDBC because we need that in order to connect to our SQL Server. Note, I'm running this purely in Python at the moment. We'll move on to doing this inside SQL Server later. This is just to kind of get it going so we can see it, we know what's happening. We can kind of test it and run it in Python and then move on to the SQL bit. So PYDBC in order to connect to SQL Server. So I've got my connection string to my test DB. And then I'm going to get a data frame. Well, you can see by hovering, it's a data frame. So pandas is going to give me my data frame. So I'm going to read the SQL query and I've just got select star from my data using that connection. And if I run this, you should see down here, there we go. We've got the data that I've just pulled in. So the oranges, apples and bananas with all the data that goes with it. So that's all good to start with. Now at this point, if you don't already have this in your system, you are going to need to do a pip install of the scikit-learn. You can see at the bottom of my screen, I've put it down there. Now if I run this, it's just going to tell me I've already got it. But you know, for anyone else, you might need to run that pip install. So once you've run it, we can then obviously change our imports. So we're now going to import from the scikit-learn. We're going to import the train test split, where it will actually split our data into a training set and a testing set. This is just the basic machine learning so that it can kind of do some tests on our training data and then validate it against some other data that we have known results just to see how well it's actually performed. I've also put pickle in. Pickle comes with Python, so you shouldn't have to any sort of pip install. We'll be using that in a bit. You'll see why it'll come up. So what I'm going to do now is I am just going to do very basic machine learning. So effectively I'm basically going to say, look, just consider the height and the width. What you're trying to get is the fruit type. So effectively based on these height and widths, I'm trying to get whether it's a 1, 2 or a 3. And then we're here just splitting it out using the train test split so that it will split it into a training set and a testing set of data. Now I'm then just going to pull in a decision tree classifier. I could run through loads of different machine learning algorithms. There's no point. This can just use a decision tree. Basically, is it round? It's this. Is it oval? It's this. Is it long and thin? It's a banana. So it can just use a decision tree. I don't need anything more complicated, and I don't really want anything more complicated. This is not, like I said, learning machine learning. This is just showing how to kind of build something into kind of an ETL-esque type mechanism. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use the decision tree. I'm going to basically get a model. So CLF is going to be my classifier model, and I'm just going to use decision tree classifier and see how well it fits with my training data. And so what we're going to do now is we're just going to run this. And if I run this, you'll see down here accuracy of decision tree classifier was 100%. So on the training set and the test set, it was absolutely spot on. So the stuff it learnt, it applied it, it was 100% right. Can't really argue with that. All good. Hence why I'm not bothering with the other machine learning algorithms. No point, this does the job. So basically we've now got a model. The key is we now have a model. Okay, so what we need to do is somehow apply this model to our ETL on the fly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to imagine, just going to copy some data. I'm going to go over to SQL Server, and I'm now going to imagine that this is the kind of gumph we're being sent. So this is kind of coming into our ETL. This we haven't painstakingly walked through and looked and seen what it's going to be. This is just stuff we've been sent. Now if we were to kind of look, we would probably guess banana, orange, apple, banana. So we can kind of guess it, but again, an ETL can't. So we need something that's going to do this for us. So this is the data that's arriving. How can we have something classify this for us as part of our ETL? Okay, so go back to our Python, and what we can do now is we can actually get let's pull that back to the start. There we go. We can actually turn our classifier model. So if you remember, this was the model we created. So this is our model. And what we're going to do is we're going to use pickle, and pickle can basically just dump out this model into an object. Now this object is kind of just a data dump. It'll come out on screen a bit like a kind of varchar-y type string, but it's actually very good for turning it into binary. So if I run this now, I'm going to get rid of my classifying data because I don't need that cluttering up my window. And now you can see we just get this dump of stuff. Okay, kind of binary dump of stuff. It's not really binary, it's more just kind of a mess, but it can be read as binary. So that's our starting point. Okay, this is a model that we can now kind of pull out. So based on my last video when I showed the interaction, I showed how we could get data in and out of Python using SQL Server. So what I'm now going to do is I'm basically going to put all of this into SQL Server. So that's what we have here. Now you'll see what I'm going to pass in. So in my Visual Studio Code, I obviously had to make a connection to SQL Server and pass it in the fruit data table. If I'm calling it from SQL Server, I don't need to do this bit, but I do need to pass in the data set. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pass in that data set. So you can see I'm going to do the fruit type ID, the width and the height. I'm converting them to floats because Python in SQL doesn't understand decimals. So it prefers floats. So if you just do a convert and pass that in, that'll work fine. So effectively we're doing a select star from fruit data, but just with a couple of conversions. So that's going to go in to our input data set, which from my last video is how it's seen when you call Python using spexecute external script. the input data you pass in is seen as input data set. It's a data frame. So I don't need to rename it as SQL data. I'm just trying to kind of keep it in the vein of this, where I was using SQL data and then I carry on using it. I can then effectively rename it to SQL data and keep using it in exactly the same. So it's effectively a copy and paste job. So you can see we no longer need pandas because by default it uses it within SQL. We just need pickle and we need our scikit-learn model. Now I can then run the same test split, I can then run the same decision tree, I can then get our model, and I can then place our model by pickle. I can pickle dump it into an object. So this will work. I can run this. Take a couple of seconds because when you first boot it up it takes a couple of seconds. That runs fine. So what we want to do is we want to get this model out. Okay, we want to get this back out into the SQL world. So how I'm going to do that, if you remember from the last video, is I can create myself a variable. So I'm going to create one that's a var binary max called the trained fruit model. And then what I can do down here is I can add, let's go over here, parameter. So I'm now going to say, okay, this is now a parameter. It's a var binary max parameter, and I want it passing out of this procedure. So once it's passed out, I'm going to put it into my variable. Okay, so if I do that, select trained fruit model. Now if I run this, you will see that we actually get out our model. There we go. So our model has now come out in a full var binary format. This is the actual model that it is using, that it has trained itself. This is the model that it uses to classify our data into fruit. Okay, all good so far. So what we're now going to do is store this. Okay, so if I go back up here, I can now create myself a table that I'm just going to call machine learning models. So we've got our model ID, just a default primary key. It's not a primary key, but you could see it could be if you wanted to label one. I've just put it as an identity column. The model name, and then the model data, the actual model itself in var binary format. So now I've got this out, I can obviously then insert this in to my table. I'm going to call it the fruit decision tree because that's my model name. It does my fruit decisions. And I'm going to put in the model into that table. So if I now run this, you will see that we now have a table that contains our fruit decision tree, and this is the model. Okay, so we've now stored our Python model. Our machine learning model is now stored in SQL Server in a table. World is good. So how do we now apply this? Okay, we now have this ludicrous data we're being sent. Okay, so we're just being sent this data every day. It's just coming into our ETL. What do we do with it? Well, we now have a model inside SQL Server. So again, based on my previous video where we were doing the interaction, I can pass this data into Python. So if I can pass this data in, I can also pass the model in. So if I pass the data and the model, Python can use that model to classify this data and return me the results. Bingo. So what we're going to do here is I am basically going to declare model as var binary max, and I'm going to go and get my fruit decision tree model. Okay, so I'm going to get that binary column, put it in here. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to pass that into my Python script as trained model, which you can then see here. So effectively what we're going to do is we're going to pass my model data into the Python script. So that's our step one. Step two, we want to get this temp data that we've created also into our Python script. So our input data is now just select our width and height from our temp table, so from the data that's coming in. So we're going to pass in the data that we need, and we're going to pass in the model. Okay, so we've said we need this to be our model. So var binary max, this is what I want you to set it to. It's going to go in here. So now if we kind of step through the Python. We're going to need pickle. We'll come to that in a second. So our input data set goes in. I'm effectively just renaming it. This is already a data frame. We could have just used it, but since I was using SQL data, I'm going to stick with it. So we're effectively just renaming the data frame to be SQL data. So this is the data we've passed in. This is our new kind of GUMP that we receive every day. Just our width and height datas. And then what we can actually do is we can get a model. So we're passing in our model in binary. Pickle can actually translate that binary into an actual model, because we pickled the model to turn it into binary. So Pickle can reverse that and put it back into a model. So effectively this is now our model. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, use that model to predict against the data we've passed in. Okay, so this is the data we passed in. We're going to use that model on the data we've passed in to predict what we think is going to happen. We're going to get a probability array, I've called it. So basically it's what it thinks is going to happen. So it's its classifications based on its model. So what I'm then going to do is I'm going to say, okay, get my data frame, add a new column to my data frame called fruit type, and fill it with that predicted fruit type. Hopefully that'll make sense. So effectively we pass in just a width and height. We pass in a model. Python uses that model to make a prediction based on the height and width data we passed in. And then we add that prediction to the data. So we're basically adding it as a new column and putting the prediction in it. And then all we're doing is we're saying, okay, now output that please. Send that back out into the real world. So if I now run this, you will see the data we passed in, the 5 rows, are now here, but with their predicted outcome, which we can actually see. 3 we know is a banana, 1 we know is an orange, 2 we know is an apple, and 3 we know is a banana. So our model was absolutely spot on, and we've now had our data passed back out to us again. So effectively you can now see that we've actually got, by doing a bit of work up front, we've generated a model. We've now got the model stored in SQL Server, and our ETL can now actually classify data that we're receiving as part of the ETL. So as it flows through, it can actually just pick it up, run it through Python, run it through a machine learning algorithm, classify the data, and feed it back into the ETL as classified data, which we can then process as part of the ETL before it ever hits production. So we're kind of using the machine learning and Python modules. We've stored it in SQL Server, and we could effectively just expand on this. I mean, this table is called machine learning models because we could have 100 models in it. We could quite easily have one for each pipeline within our ETL. So our ETL could be doing numerous calls out to Python, having different data classified in different ways, running different algorithms, basically manipulating our data prior to it going into production so that we can actually filter it as part of the ETL process. So it's just a nice way of using Python via SQL Server. As I said, not the actual machine learning itself, but very, very powerful if you already know the machine learning and you want to kind of just build it into an ETL. So hopefully that was kind of useful. Again, as with the other videos, I will try and put this into an actual written blog on our website. So qtech.co.uk. Head over there, hundreds of blogs. Like I said, I'll try and add this one to it along with the previous ones. And yeah, all good. Like, subscribe, whatever. And that's it. See you later.